Russell Wilson wasn't. Yeah.
All right, well, let's get this show on the road. We've got lots of people on Zoom around the world, worldwide production here at the Wharton Institute. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us. We'll do a little t-shirt toss later, maybe during some Q&A. And got some stickers up here if you're interested in checking out our Faith and Economics podcast that we do weekly. Some great stuff has been on there, including inflation and lots of other stuff. All right, so let me introduce tonight's speaker, my friend and colleague, Dr. Peter Jacobsen. Got his PhD from George Mason University, and he is our Wharton Institute Professor of Economic Education and Research. So he does teaches various classes here at Ottawa. He's also the director of our MBA program, so he's off to a running start as one of our younger professors, and you're going to find he's a very sharp guy, and he'll have a lot to say on this. He's also been a prolific writer here with the Foundation for Economic Education. I printed some of these off because the reason why we chose inflation is that somehow Peter has been becoming the expert on inflation, even though I'm pretty sure he would not call himself a macroeconomist of any sort. But he even had a congressman call for his opinion on something. I can't remember what all the details were, but he's getting noticed by people as a person to talk to about inflation. So there's 7 articles that he did on inflation. What does 7.5% inflation mean? What is a non-fungible token and why are some worth so much money? Top Clinton economist labels Biden administration proposal to curb inflation science denial. Dollar Tree loses its 35-year war with inflation. Don't kill crypto. The infrastructure bill contains a poison pill for crypto. No, higher wages aren't a silver lining of inflation. And finally, why inflation is at a 12-year high. So these are all the articles that are all about inflation. He's been writing this last year quite a bit of stuff. So you can check that out by just Googling Peter's name, and FEE is the Foundation for Economic Education. So without further ado, Dr. Peter Jacobsen. Let's give him a round of applause.
Let's go.
We're going to start off tonight. I'm thinking of breaking this into kind of 2 sections here, because I don't want to do like talking to you for an hour and 15 minutes straight. I think that could be kind of like tiring. So I'm thinking what we're going to do is we'll have about 30 minutes on inflation, and then a short Q&A on that 30 minutes, maybe a little bit of a break, maybe a 10-minute break or so, and then we'll come back and do the second 30 minutes, and we'll be done for the night. And so we're going to talk about what inflation is, what's going on, and then the second half is going to be like, why is this happening? So let's go ahead and get started. Screen share. Slides. Okay. Oh, maybe this one. Okay. Okay, so you probably see headlines around, a bunch of different news agencies here. I put a collection of them. The summary of the last week, I'd say 6 months here, has been rising inflation. In fact, we've now hit the point you can see up there. We were at a 39-year high by some measures of inflation. up to 7.5%. And actually, this 39-year high looks like it's about to become a 40-year high as well. Okay, got it now. So 40-year high, there's lots of measures of inflation. This is a pretty consistent theme. All of them seem to be rising. And so you might be wondering, what is inflation? And so economists have a pretty standard definition of inflation. You probably kind of generally understand it, but I want to make one thing clear up front. Inflation is not just gas prices rising or food prices rising. It's not about the rise of one price in particular. Inflation, as economists generally understand it, is a rise in the average price level. And so what we can do is we can add up all the prices in the economy, see what the average is, and if that average starts to increase, we have what economists refer to as inflation. And so Russ mentioned a few of my key articles up front. One of the recent surprising things to a lot of people was that we had rising prices at even the Dollar Tree. So the Dollar Tree famously, since its founding in the 70s, has had $1 price goods. Now they're having 125 prices. You can see someone sick to their stomach. Maybe a slight exaggeration, but even the Dollar Tree is raising prices. So there's something significant going on here right now that an institution who's been charging $1 for everything for 30, 40 years actually now, suddenly has had to raise prices. And so economists have a measure of inflation. We won't go too much over the details. All this slide is talking about is what's called the Consumer Price Index. And so it turns out it's both actually really hard to get all the prices in the economy, and some prices aren't really useful. And so, for example, if there is a price of tanks out there, you could go out and measure how much it costs to buy a tank. Most of you in this room probably have not bought a tank, probably will not buy a tank, right? So the price of tanks may not be a very good measure of if prices on average are increasing for like ordinary people. And so to deal with this fact that some goods are important for inflation, some goods aren't so much, economists create what's called an index. And so the Consumer Price Index is a common one. It's a measure of the average change in prices of goods purchased by ordinary urban consumers, is what they say. And what they do with this measure is they make a basket of goods. And so they say, well, let's put oranges in the basket for goods and gasoline in the basket for goods and houses. We're going to take a group of different goods prices and we're going to measure just those instead of worrying about all the prices in the economy. So this is called the CPI. It's the most common measure of inflation that economists talk about when they talk about inflation. There are others, but for our purposes, at least tonight, we can kind of stick with CPI. In fact, we can even talk about maybe later some of the problems. And so does CPI actually matter? Well, yes and no. CPI is a pretty good indicator, but for example, fuel is considered somewhere between 3 and 5% of normal Americans' budgets according to CPI. That's probably true if you live in a city, but if you're living in a rural place, if you're driving 15 miles to work, for example, right now, fuel likely, if you're just a middle-income person, is rising about 5% of your budget. So the CPI doesn't change, even though the weight in there is selected as 5%. So even though prices are going way up, CPI doesn't change. So in some ways, CPI might underestimate, for example, the effect of certain prices on people's budgets. And so inflation, CPI inflation might be at 7.5%, but actually the normal everyday person might be feeling a lot higher inflation than 7.5% because maybe fuel is a bigger part of your budget than someone who lives in the city, for example, takes the bus to work, right? And so our measure is from January of 2021 to January of this year, 2022, our CPI rose 7.5%. And so that means the average price of all the goods considered in CPI is 7.5% higher than it was just a year ago. This is the highest again since 1982, February of 1982, the highest annual inflation rate that we've had in a long time. So for most of you, that's before you were born. In fact, it was before I was born, 1982. So none of you have probably seen inflation to this level in your lifetimes. Some of you may never see inflation like this again. It's hard to say. And so, this still kind of begs the question, well, what is inflation? What does it really mean to have higher prices? Because we kind of know what 7.5% is a little bit, but what does it look like for something to be 7.5% bigger? It's a little bit of a complicated way to think about things. The first thing to realize is that inflation, that measure that we're talking about today, it's about growth. not levels. And so let's imagine all of a sudden inflation rises like it has before. And so from 2021 to 2022, maybe in 2021 it cost you $100 to go to the grocery store. And that was what you spent on groceries. After 1 year of 7.5% inflation, now that trip to the grocery store costs $100 or $107.55 rather, or 50 cents. And so that's the 7.5, or that's the 7.5%. But now let's imagine that inflation doesn't grow at all next year. From 2022 to 2023, we have 0% inflation. Notice with 0% higher prices, we still have higher prices than we initially had. And so 7.5% inflation doesn't go away if next year you have 0% inflation. So when inflation starts to fall, if you start seeing news headlines, oh, inflation's fallen to 3%, that doesn't mean prices are going down. It actually means that the rate that prices are increasing is slowing down. And so unless inflation becomes negative within the next 10 years, we're going to have permanent higher prices actually. And so inflation being 0% doesn't fix this. It's a rate that prices grow. It's not a level of what prices are. And so one way that we could maybe visualize this is we've got like a bathtub here. And so the bathtub, the water there is maybe your price level. And the higher the water is, the higher prices are. Inflation you can think of as water coming in. And so when you shut off the faucet, the prices aren't falling. The bath water does not fall out unless you've got deflation or disinflation, some water coming out of the bathtub. And so that's the difference between a growth and a level. Just think of a bathtub. If we have inflation, water is flowing into the bathtub. If inflation stops suddenly, the water's still there. The prices are actually permanently higher. And so the first thing to notice about inflation and what it means for you is that it's a permanent change. Unless later there's a negative rate of inflation, prices are going to remain higher. And there could be. But if you see 0% inflation, your problems might not be solved. In fact, your budget might be just as tight as it was the day before. And so 7.5% is still a little bit, we'll say, ethereal. It still maybe doesn't make sense. So what does it mean for something to be 7.5% bigger? One way we can think about 7.5% inflation is to use what financiers call, or financial analysts call, the rule of 72. And so the rule of 72 says this. Basically, if you have anything that's growing, what you can do is you can take 72 divided by the growth rates, and that number is going to give you how long it takes for things to double. And so in our example right here, we've got 72. We divide that by 7.5 because we have 7.5% inflation. And that's happening yearly. So what that means is 72 divided by 7.5, prices will double in 9.6 years. And so that means if inflation were to continue at the rate it was today, look at the gas station out there. I think prices right now for gas are like $3.60. That means, again, if inflation continues the rate it is, that's $3.60 times 2 would be $7.20 per gallon of gas. And then in California, you're up to, I don't know, $500. And so that's kind of what 7.5% means. Obviously, 7.5% itself maybe doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you, but when you think of it in terms of, well, how long does it take to double? Our usual inflation in this country is something like 2 or 3%. And so that would put prices doubling every 30-something years. And now they're doubling, again, at the current rate, if it were to continue, every 10 years. And so here's just some simple math showing you what it would look like over this process. We have our $100 grocery trip. That increases by 7.5%. You just multiply by 1.75. At the end of year one, you've got $107.50 as your grocery trip. And then you keep doing that. The next year, that new higher price at the same rate of inflation is going to come to 115. And what you can see, the math checks out, our rule 72 works, is that somewhere between years 9 and 10, our inflation puts our grocery trip $200. And so if you spend $400 a month, if inflation continues the way it is, in 10 years, you'll be spending $800 a month. Spend $50 a month, it'll be $100. So that's basically what this means. The rule of 72 works with any rate. You can always get how many years it will take to double. That's just kind of the process, the proof that we can see that that's what's going to happen. This was an article, Russ mentioned one of the few articles that I wrote. I saw this article and I couldn't not write about it. It was such an infuriating headline to read as an economist that when I saw it, I had to write a story about why this is nonsense. And so you can see up there, This is CNBC, very respected, a top of the line article. Inflation silver lining, higher wages. That was the title. And so the point of this article, or the arguments in this article, especially initially, was, well, inflation's not so bad because actually wages are going to go up. So that's okay. In fact, it's a good thing that wages are going to go up. If you know anything about economics, you might think, well, this is crazy. But if you don't, you might actually think, well, maybe that would be good, right? Higher wages. This article got a lot of backlash, and after the fact, they actually changed aspects of it. So you can see, like this blurb at the bottom is actually maybe saying the opposite of the article. It's actually, oh, we don't know if it's going to work out. This is because after the fact, it got so much backlash that they changed some of the social media blurbs for the article. And so here's the question is, well, could inflation lead to higher wages? And the answer is yes, but no, is the simple answer. And in order to understand why, we have to talk about something called real wages. And so inflation might lead to what's called higher nominal wages. And here's how you can think of nominal wages. Nominal wages are just the number that's on your paycheck. And so maybe you're getting paid $1,200 a month right now. And after inflation, you might be getting paid $1,300. That maybe sounds good on paper. In general, you probably like a higher number, right? But that's different from what's called your real wages. Economists aren't super interested on what the number on your paycheck is. In fact, if you want a good proof of that, there's lots of countries where the numbers on paychecks are way higher than here, that are way poorer, right? If you move to Mexico, your paycheck is going to have a larger number on it than here in the United States. But we all sort of implicitly recognize that that is not a better situation, right? On average, people in the United States are richer than people in Mexico. So what's going on? Well, the number on your paycheck doesn't tell you how wealthy you are. It's actually what the number can buy that determines how wealthy you are. Economists call basically what you can buy with your wage, a real wage, the actual physical goods or services that you could get from purchasing with your money. And so I've got this sort of rhetorical question on here. I imagine I don't actually have to push you too hard to answer that. Would you rather have a number on your paycheck that says $3,000 that can pay for 3 months of rent, or a paycheck that has $5,000 on it that can only pay 1 month of rent? And assuming your house is the same, this is pretty obvious, right? You'd rather have the number of 3,000 that can cover more months of rents, especially if this is true about everything. And so what matters isn't the number on your paycheck. Maybe some people have some pride on that. They really like the 6 figures or something like that. But remember, rule of 72, in 10 years, if inflation continues the way it is now, actually you'll be making 6 figures if you're making $50,000 a year right now. So actually the number is the important part. It's really what the number buys you. And so I've just got like a little thought experiment up here, a little bit of an example. And so we can imagine, again, I'm going to keep using the grocery example because I think this is a somewhat relatable thing that most of us buy. We go out and buy groceries. So let's say that you've got a job for $8 an hour. Let's start off with that. And you have to pay $200 per month for groceries. Maybe that's your monthly grocery bill. What we can do is we can actually use that wage and use how much the groceries cost and figure out, well, how many hours of working would you have to actually buy those groceries? And we can see if we just do the math, 200 divided by 8, that's going to come out to 25 hours. Now, let's say that you're given some raise, the silver lining of inflation, higher wages. You get a raise from your boss. And so now you're making $10 an hour. But at the same time that you get a raise, you notice all the prices in the grocery store are higher. Now buying the same groceries costs you $250. You can see where this ends, right? The exact same goods, even with higher wages, might be something that you have to spend the exact same amount of time to purchase. And so it's the same amount of hours of work to purchase the same amount of goods. Higher wages is not necessarily a silver lining right here. Just having a bigger number on the paycheck doesn't help if you can't buy you this much. And so your real wage is the same, your nominal wage is, your real wage is the same, your nominal wage is higher. And so one of the issues is you might think, well, what would be the big deal if they both went up by the same amount? Well, actually, in reality, the problem is they don't really go up at the same time. In fact, think of how your wages are usually determined at your jobs. If you've got a salary job, maybe you have like an annual review. If you're at an entry-level job, you might not get raises ever, right? It might be either, work for minimum wage or you hit the road. That might be your pay structure. So actually, the prices of goods could go up before you get any real sort of wage or any real sort of raise. So if you're in a job that you do an annual review every year and your annual review determines when you get a raise, well, if you're halfway through the year, prices start rising. Sorry, you have to wait 6 months before you maybe get the raise to make up for it. So actually, even though maybe wages and prices go up, what economists basically note is that it seems to be the case that wages are going to go up a little bit more slowly than other prices. And that means you're poorer. That's the bottom line, is that you have less money than you would if there had been no inflation. So I'm sorry, CNBC, if there is a silver lining, it's not going to be that. And so if you only get, and sometimes, by the way, they don't keep up. The prices and wages don't keep up. You could get maybe a 3% raise one year. By the way, if any of you got a 3% raise or 5% raise or 6% raise or even a 7% raise, I'm sorry, you have a pay cut this year because our prices have risen 7.5%. So you can buy less actual stuff, even though maybe you got a raise because you got a nominal raise, but not a real raise. That's not the only way that inflation causes problems, though. So one way is that you can have lower wages. But another problem of inflation is it hurts savings and savers. And so probably all of you in school at some point, certainly in Russ's personal finance class, if you haven't already had it, you're told that a responsible thing to do is to have a certain number of savings on hand, or a certain amount of savings on hand. My wife and I like to keep 6 months of savings on hand. And this is for like emergencies, if someone were to lose a job, anything like that. It's a good idea to have some money in the bank, so that way you're not immediately out of luck. Now, this is something that we're taught in school, but actually not a lot of people have savings. And you know, there's maybe a reason for this. Like, not a lot of people keep 6 months of savings on hand. Well, here's one potential reason. Let's say that you have some rainy day fund of $10,000. That's how much you have tucked away in the bank. And so you have that money, and your rent is $1,000 a month. Pretty standard for Ottawa, I think. You know, if you want a house here, it's a little bit under 1,000, maybe, but 1,000. So it works here. Other places probably a lot more. And now we have inflation. Well, inflation is a general rise in the prices. In fact, housing is a huge part of inflation. It's one of the most weighted of all the different categories. And so let's imagine that now your rent goes up to $1,250. It's the new year. The landlord says, sorry, inflation, all my costs are going up. I'm going to have to raise rent this year. Some of you might have just recently experienced this, actually. I know I have with my mortgage payments. They went up, I think, like $3 or $4, which is not much for a mortgage. But rent is a little bit more flexible to go up. And so previously, before inflation, this rainy day fund that you had of $10,000 covered a full 10 months of rent. Now it covers 8 months of rent. And so actually, just like inflation can eat away at your real wages, it can actually eat away at the real value of your savings. And so it not only hurts wage earners, but it hurts savers. And so after the break, we're going to talk about why this could be happening. Why is it that we're having inflation now? Maybe you've heard some answers. I think some of those answers are good. I think some of them are actually very bad, very inept answers. And so we'll talk about why, but we're going to pause here and we'll do a little bit of Q&A. And so I think, you know, about 10 minutes, any questions you have to this point. Obviously, why is not a question that you should ask at this point because we will be getting to that. But I'm happy to take questions now. So, yes.
If inflation, if your wage increases and your can't keep up with rising inflation rates and is already eating into your savings, how can you make sure that it lasts as long that what you do have lasts as long as it possibly can?
This is something that I'll probably cover in the second half. I do have to be clear here that I maybe technically in some level allowed to, but I'm also not really allowed to give financial advice. And so let me qualify with that. I'm not going to give you any financial advice. I don't want you coming back and saying I gave you bad advice. But what I will say is this. There are assets in this world, financial assets, whose value rises when the rest of the prices are rising. A savings account is not one of them, right? Your savings account or your checking account is not going up in value as prices rise. But there are assets, and we'll actually talk about some of the assets. So that's a good question. There are sort of ways to protect against it, though. Awesome.
What's the most effective way to limit inflation? And maybe repeat the question too. We should.
Sure. So the first question was something along the lines of what's maybe an effective way to stop your wages or your savings from being eaten away by inflation? And the answer just briefly was there are certain assets that allow you to do that. Lawson's question was, what are some ways to limit or prevent inflation? Again, we get into it a little bit in the second half, but I will say upfront, inflation as a phenomenon is something that is basically chosen, it's caused. There's a very clear cause of inflation. And so it's not like it just happens and that it's not like a fire that starts and you have to put it out. There is something or someone who's generally responsible for starting the fire. I will say one other thing that maybe you can do in terms of preventing inflation is being more flexible in the sorts of assets that you're willing to hold. And that kind of alludes to the thing that I said earlier is actually, if a lot of people protected themselves against inflation, there probably wouldn't be as much inflation. And I know it's like a cop-out to say this, but I can explain why later. I want to do that after the second half. So Alexis.
How do we go back? So we're at 7.5% inflation right now. How do we go back? So we're at 7.5% inflation right now, and you mentioned earlier that 0% isn't going to change anything. We have to get to the negatives. How does that look for us as the consumer? How do we go back?
Yeah, absolutely. And so one thing to note is it might actually not be the best thing just to try to go back. And the reason is, like I mentioned, it does take a while for wages to catch up, but when they do, things sort of go back to normal. In other words, if all the prices are higher and your wages catch up, it might not be necessary to go back because you're kind of back to normal. You've lost money, you've lost wealth, and that's probably something that bothers a lot of you. But there's no like reclaiming that wealth, at least not in any clear way. Now, if you wanted to go back, either decrease positive inflation or even lead to deflation, unfortunately, some of the ways are very ugly, which we'll talk about later. So like one way that prices fall is if there's like a recession or something like that. When there's a recession, people stop buying stuff and prices go down. But there are maybe better ways. And I've realized now, with the way that I've broken up the Q&As, a lot of my answers are, well, we'll talk about that after the break. Unfortunately, I think that is going to be the answer to quite a few of them. Go. Actually,
Yeah, let's run the mic.
When you talked about CPI, how would they calculate the average prices for like gas when it changes so much and it's different across like the entire country or even across different countries?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. A really good question for the first half that I can answer. So thank you. Yeah, so the way that it's done, by the way, gas is sometimes total. There are other measures of inflation where gasoline is totally excluded. And in fact, some of the reason that CPI is assigned like a lower weight than some people think, like, well, gas isn't 3% of my budget, that doesn't make any sense. One of the reasons that it explains that gas is given a lower weight is that it actually moves around a lot. And maybe the fact that it's so volatile actually kind of makes it hard for us to tell if there's real inflation going on. And so the way that this is dealt with is basically, again, the CPI is based on a survey of urban areas. And so what Russ, do you know the Bureau? Is it Bureau of Labor Statistics?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Bureau of Labor Statistics basically will go out at intervals during the year, each quarter. And what they do is they go to different urban areas and they measure the prices. And then they just literally take the average. Now, they also have to do things like monitor, for example, how often people purchase that. And so they're going out and looking at the frequency of purchase too. Because one thing to kind of note is an average of prices, well, they don't just take, like the price of TVs is $100, the price of gas is $2, and our average is, somewhere in the middle, like $47. That's not how it works, right? The reason that's not how it works is you don't buy as many TVs as you do gallons of gas, right? And so they have to kind of do what's called a weighted average, which is they survey people, they figure out, well, how frequently are you buying gas? How many trips do you take to the gas station? And then instead of just averaging a TV and a gallon of gas, what they do is they average one TV and maybe 400 gallons of gas. And so it'd be 100 plus 2 plus 2 plus over right now, plus 4 plus 4 plus 4, 100 times, and then find the average that way, if that makes sense. So basically, the Bureau of Labor Statistics goes out and collects that. There's lots of specifics on their methodology, but the basic goal is for them to find in urban areas, and so they ignore all the small towns and the rural areas, and they go out and measure what the average is. Justin? Thank you.
You talked about changes in rent and like how this can affect you if you're paying rent or if your grocery bill. It seems like this can affect different people in different ways. Are there certain groups of people that pay that a rise in inflation affects more than other people?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we talked about some of those assets that tend to rise as prices rise. One of those assets is like stocks. That's a good spoiler that I can give you right here. It's like you notice that prices are rising, but also the stock market's going up, right? And some people are like very confused about this. Like, how could, you know, prices are getting way high. It's really hard for me to afford my bills. Stocks are also going up in price. Like that, aren't stocks supposed to show whether the economy is good? It doesn't feel good to me. Well, no, stocks, just like anything else, the price of a stock is the price of the assets. And so if everything is rising in price, that's going to include stocks. And so people who have stocks, like a lot of stocks, people who have a lot of financial capital, probably aren't as worried about inflation as people who like keep cash, right? Or people who have savings accounts. And so a lot of times people say that inflation is what we call regressive. In other words, it tends to hurt poor, especially a group called the unbanked. It's people who don't have bank accounts, who don't have financial capital. It tends to hurt them more than it hurts the rich who have access to maybe some of these financial assets. But there's other categories too. We mentioned that savers are a group that is hurt when inflation rises. Well, actually a group that's helped if inflation is rising is a debtor, someone who owes money, right? And so if you owe money, on a loan or something like that, and prices start rising and eventually your wage keeps up, well, the loan amount stays the same on most things. And so like mortgages don't rise with inflation. Generally in this country, there are some countries where they do, by the way, but not in this country. Your student loan debt isn't going up with inflation. And so it's actually conceivable that, yeah, some people would be made better off by inflation. It's the people who maybe owe a lot of money. But that actually tends to be counterbalanced by the fact that those people also tend to be exactly the people we were talking about who don't have like a lot of stocks and things like that. And so it's not exactly clear whether debtors are necessarily helped, but at least relative to people who are lending money, debtors are made better off.
So you were talking about keeping the inflation at 2 to 3%, and we are at 7.5% now. My question for you is, do you think we are potentially in a market bubble similar to that of 2008, the Great Recession, or in the 70s when we had big inflation like this?
There's kind of a tough answer for this. Bubbles are usually associated with particular markets. And so like a housing bubble is what we experienced most recently. The prices of housing was going up. But when the housing bubble was going on, it was actually the price of housing going up relative to everything else. And so the price of everything else was staying the same, but housing was going up. So bubbles are usually concentrated in specific industries. It could be the case, though, we talked about stocks. It could be the case that there is a high price for capital as a whole. So stocks are measures of basically capital values. And so productive machinery, for example, is a type of capital. If it's the case that people are over confident about the price of productive machinery, it could be that, well, actually all capital has a higher than true price, we could say maybe. And there could be maybe a bubble across all capital, and maybe that's dragging all the prices up with it. I'm a little wary of bubble explanations, and the reason I'm wary of them is if you can properly identify a bubble, you can actually make a ton of money. So like you've probably seen or heard of the movie The Big Short, right? The Big Short is a movie about people who recognized that there was a bubble in the housing market. They made a ton of money off of it. So anybody who says, well, there's a bubble here, my question to them is, well, how much money have you put up to, short it, right? If you were so convinced it's a bubble, you surely have thousands and thousands of dollars gambling that it is a bubble. Most people don't who claim that bubbles are there. And so I'm a little wary about bubble-based explanations because what they're really saying is, I know what the price really is, and other people haven't figured it out yet. And I tend to not, I like my economic knowledge, but I'm not going to assume I know more than thousands of people who trade stocks. So, okay, let's take our short 10-minute break now, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about why inflation. So why now? All right. So the question is, that I left off with, is why? Why is it the case that all of a sudden we're having this inflation problem? And so, like Russ mentioned, I wrote an article about this. You can actually see the date on that, was back in May of 2021. And so I've been talking about this for about a year now, pretty close to a year now, because it was pretty easy to see these signs actually a lot earlier than a lot of people were talking about them. When inflation first started rising, a lot of people were saying that this is transitory. What that means is it's just temporary. It's a little blip. We had a few little issues and it's going to go back to normal. But I actually argued in this article back in May that that's probably not the case. And we're going to discuss why. First off, before I discuss why inflation's at a now 40-year high, I want to talk about why not. Russ mentioned that article that I put out there about President Clinton's chief economic advisor, Larry Summers, came out and said basically that the current plan to fix inflation is actually anti-scientific. That's basically what he equated it to. And the reason is the current scapegoat, we'll say, and I'll call it a scapegoat because I think it's a very, inaccurate explanation. The current scapegoat is greed. You've probably heard politicians say this already. It's that inflation is high right now because businesses are greedy. There's a very easy explanation for why this is not right. Businesses have always been greedy. They were greedy yesterday, they were greedy a year ago. If they weren't greedy, they wouldn't stay in business, right? The whole point of business is to make more money than everybody else. We know businesses are greedy. And so that hasn't really changed. The question you have to ask yourself is, if inflation is high because businesses are greedy, were they not being greedy last year when prices were lower? Obviously, there's not a good answer for this. And so if you ask one of these politicians, well, why weren't they greedy last year? You're going to be met with, nonsense response because there's no good reason for this. I put on the board another illustration of this. Like yesterday, I heard my youngest daughter, who's 2 years old, crying, and I know she's alone in the room with my 4-year-old. And so I went in and I said, my older daughter's name is Cedar. I said, Cedar, what happens? I know what happens already. There's a 2-year-old on the floor crying and a 4-year-old with like Legos clutched in her hands. I already know what happens. And she said, well, I didn't push her. It was gravity. She fell down because of gravity. All of you recognize that that's a bad explanation. Another way that you could describe this bad explanation is like if you saw a news story where there was a plane crash and the news anchors said, yes, unfortunately, gravity claims another plane this time. It's like, no, that's not the explanation. We know that gravity is always there, just like greed is always there. Constant things in the world can't explain changing things in the world. That's not how it works. The fact that there's gravity can't cause planes to crash. The actual cause is like the engine stopped working, right? Or a flock of birds hit it. Or my older daughter pushed my younger daughter and took the Legos out of her hands, right? Maybe gravity did not help in this process, but it wasn't the cause because gravity is always there. And so greed can't be the cause of rising inflation because why would we expect businesses are they greedier today than they were yesterday? Or even if, by the way, even if you don't think businesses are greedy, the same thing holds. If businesses aren't greedy today, well, if they're not greedy yesterday, that can't cause inflation either. And so whether businesses are or aren't greedy, we can't really explain inflation with greed. It just doesn't make sense. And so my arguments to you tonight is that the cause of inflation, well, you can find it, it's really all about money. It's all about the money. And so we're going to go through a thought experiment here. We're going to think about a different world than our own, but maybe not so different when we get into some of the information. Let's imagine that we live in a world where suddenly tomorrow you wake up and all your money has multiplied by 10. So you had a $10 bill in your pocket, it's now a $100 bill in your pocket. You had $1,000 in your bank account, now you have $10,000 in your bank account. Everything, every penny, pennies become dimes, dimes become dollars, everything is multiplied by 10. What are you going to go do? Honest question. Yeah, well, you're going to go out and buy things, right? We could think of some examples here. Some of you have student loans. Well, if you took out a $7,000 student loan and that balance is in your bank account right now, congratulations, you could go buy a Porsche if you wanted to, right? A low-end Porsche for $70,000. If you're a kid who gets like a nice $10 allowance, well, you can afford a flat screen TV. That's awesome for you. Or like a Wii, right? Or I should know. Nintendo Switch, that's what it is nowadays. Sorry, my old man is coming out here. So a lot of people have more money and they go out and spend that money. This makes sense to us, all of us understand if we were 10 times richer, that's what we would do. But this is where actually things get more complicated. We start to have some problems arise. Now, everybody who wanted a car but didn't have enough money, they go and buy it. Well, all the cars suddenly are being driven off the lot, right? The Porsche dealership starts to lose all of its Porsches to these overnight millionaires. You know, the TVs of the stores, well, you know, all those people wanted those new smart TVs, well, they can easily afford it now, right? Everything, their money's multiplied by 10. You know, every house offer, if you live in Ottawa, this is actually probably something you experienced this last year. If you were buying a house, I guess that probably doesn't apply to most of you. But if you were looking for a rental house, you might have seen something similar, which is that all of a sudden, you know, a house goes up for sale and then 2 days later it's gone. Or a house goes up for rent and you call and sorry, we already have someone else who's coming to check it out. So everything starts disappearing in, you know, very fast rates. It's hard to buy things. And so what's going on here is there's more money, but there's the exact same amount of stuff than there was before. In other words, you have more dollars chasing the same amount of goods. And so now a bunch of people are fighting over these goods. They're trying to get there in time. What happens when you have a lot of people bidding for something and there's not enough to go around?
Price goes up.
Yeah, price goes up, right? This is how it works on eBay. You'd much rather be in an eBay auction with one other person than with 100 other people. The more people who are trying to buy something, the higher the price goes. And so prices are bid up in this economy. And in fact, in economics, I don't really have too much time to get into the details of why this theory is true, but I will mention it. In the 70s, an economist, Milton Friedman, developed or kind of created a new theory, or he made it more clear, called the quantity theory of money. And basically the quantity theory of money says this, is that if the amount of money in the economy goes up by 10%, then prices will eventually also go up by 10%. In other words, if you print more dollars and chase the same goods, prices are going to rise by that same percent. And so suddenly, when we have 10 times more money in the economy, well, now our prices are going to be 10 times higher. That's what the quantity theory of money would predict. And so $1 candy bars become $10 candy bars. TVs are now thousands of dollars instead of hundreds of dollars. Now a $100,000 house in Kansas, congratulations if you own one, you're a million. But also if you want to buy one, you have to have $1 million too. And so it's not the case that this would all happen immediately. It would take a while for the prices to be bid up. Probably the first person who wakes up and sees their new bank account balance, they're going to be able to get the Porsche. But as they start to get driven off the lot, the salespeople think, wow, a lot of people want to buy today. We got to start raising our prices. We got to, convince less people to drive off the lot with our Porsche. So we're going to run out. We're going to make no commission. So we want to raise the price. And so, this kind of continues. The story continues here, where now a bunch of stuff is flying off the shelves. Businesses are responding to demands, and so they need some more help. Producers of goods need to produce more goods. People who sell goods, like again, used car lots, well, they have to have more workers to sell goods because they can't keep up with the demands that's going on. And so they start hiring people, and in fact, they have to convince people to take the jobs. And those people weren't working before, and so what do? How do you convince someone to take a job? Raise the wage, right? And so wages, after prices rise, wages would start to rise. So suddenly your uncle who was sitting around waiting for that six-figure offer to finally come in, well, now he gets it, but it's for a used car lot in town. Because a $20,000 a year job becomes a $200,000 a year job because they're trying to convince people to work. But remember, this isn't real wealth for your uncle. He didn't actually get the six-figure job that he always wanted. He got a much less valuable six-figure job. Real wages aren't actually rising. In other words, this person is being fooled. They're being tricked. Someone who was holding out for a six-figure job and now they've accepted it. Well, they didn't accept the six-figure job they wanted to. They've been tricked by this weird thing that's going on with money, with prices. And so one of the things that's certainly true is this fooling is not an accident. Actually, if you read standard economics textbooks, this is no secret. If you've taken macroeconomics here, you've learned this. Basically, the fooling is intentional. Economists know that this happens, and in fact, they want it to happen. And so economists lay out this thing called monetary policy. And monetary policy is our policy for deciding how much money should be out there. That's one way of thinking about it. And what economists have, one conclusion a lot of economists have come to over the years is, well, if we increase the amount of money, that's going to increase prices, and people are actually going to take jobs that they wouldn't before. And so they're fooling people, again, purposely. It's in the textbooks. They might not use the word fooling, but that's an instrumental part of the model. If everyone realized what was going on, all economists agree this trick wouldn't actually work. But the idea is, let's increase the money, and then we can decrease the number of people who don't have jobs. This is the goal. And so, now listen to this story and see what sounds familiar to you based on your experience. We have a bad economy that needs a jump start. We have suddenly the jump start starts happening, and unemployment starts to plummet, maybe from like 16% to like what it is today, like 2% or something like that, a really fast fall. And then prices rise throughout the economy. This sounds really familiar, doesn't it? The story of our last 2 years is this: we had very high unemployment. Now unemployment's relatively low compared to where it was, and prices are going up. And so you might have seen this meme on the internet, maybe you haven't. But what's gone on over the last 2 years is, in fact, a lot of money printing. The Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, which is the agency that we task with deciding how much money is in the economy, has in fact been printing money at a record pace since 2020. And here's a graph which, now that you know the things you know, you will probably find shocking. Oh, the graph will come in a second. How fast are we printing our money? First, I'll give you some numbers. To understand how fast we're printing it, first we have to realize it's not easy to figure out how much money is out there. Money is not as solid of a term as you think. You probably think of like cash when you think of money. There's a question, well, is your house money? Well, because you can, maybe trade your house for something. But everyone knows not really. Your house has value, but it's not exactly money. What about a savings account? Well, you also can't actually buy things with a savings account, can you? You have to first convert it into checking or withdraw from the bank. But it is kind of more money than a house. And so economists created this measure called M2. M2 is the most generally accepted measure of money out there. And so what M2 looks at is it says, well, let's look at all of the currency. And so that's like the physical dollar bills, all the checking account deposits. And there's this tiny category called traveler's checks that's thrown in there as well. These are very liquid things. That's called M1. And then on top of M1, they consider a few less liquid, but still pretty liquid assets, like savings deposits. And small time sort of like CDs under $100,000, money market mutual funds. There's a few other small categories here that count as money. The thought is, well, not every asset is money, but certainly even some of these less liquid assets like your savings account, that's still money, basically. You can pretty quickly turn that into something you can buy with. And so M2 is basically the economist's running definition of, well, this is still considered money, M2. And so here's our distorted graph. So you can see at the beginning here, we have way back in the 60s, and we have today at the other end. And you can look and see very clearly at about January of 2020, which is that point right there, we have kind of an extreme change. The graphs like this are sometimes called hockey stick graphs. Anytime you have a hockey stick graph where suddenly something that was sloping a little bit starts sloping a ton, you know that you have something interesting is happening. So this graph is kind of like a hockey stick. This is the money supply. And so around 2020, January 2020, the Federal Reserve started printing a lot more money. In fact, so much more, well, our money supply has increased by 42% in the last 2 years. So there's a 42% increase since January of 2020. Another way we could say this is 29%, almost 30% of all the money in circulation right now in the United States was printed in the last 2 years. So almost a third of all the money that exists out there in bank accounts and people's wallets, that was printed in the last 2 years. And so this is literally record-breaking increase in the supply of money. This isn't just true in the United States, by the way. I did an article, Canada's money supply had a little bit smaller, but a very similar increase. This is pretty common across the world that this happens. And we know from our conversation on the quantity theory of money Well, if it's true that prices rise by the same percentage that the amount of money rises, well, a 42% increase in the supply of money, we would actually expect that to turn into a 42% higher price level. And so that's 42% of inflation that we have to get through before inflation would become zero again. And so this could be spread out over time, right? It's not like we're going to get 42% in 1 year, but we just got 7%. And so what would that mean? That would mean at least 6 more years of that 7% inflation. Now, this isn't the only thing that can affect inflation. I mentioned earlier, for example, like a recession could cause prices to fall. But the point is that everything else ignored, at the end of the effect of all this money hitting the economy, prices will be, according to the quantity theory of money, 42% higher than they would have been. That might not be 42% higher than in the beginning, because maybe some other factors are maybe pushing prices down, but it's 42% higher than it would have been. And so kind of the mechanism that this works through is when the Federal Reserve prints money, it doesn't just, you're not missing any fun drop parties where the Federal Reserve is throwing money out of helicopters. Maybe that would be nice. But instead, basically what they do is they give this out to the banking system. There's various channels that they do this, but they offer the money to banks. And then when the banks have a ton of money in their vaults, they can offer loans to businesses. And when there's lots of loan money, it actually becomes very easy to get a loan. Interest rates fall. That's what you have to pay when you get a loan, the interest rate. Well, just like any other price, if you increase the amount of money available, you increase the amount of money out there, well, then the value of that money, or excuse me, what you have to pay to get that money is going to go down. It's like if we increase the amount of cars in the economy, the price of cars, everything else probably would go down. And so interest rates are falling. That makes people more likely to borrow. And so they borrow from the banks. There's a lot more going on here. In fact, there's some things that even puzzle me a little bit. We've got this 2% inflation target that the Federal Reserve has. So basically the Federal Reserve's goal, according to their mission, is we want to keep inflation around 2%. Obviously, they're not succeeding right now. For a long time, the Federal Reserve said, well, we're not succeeding right now, but we're not going to do anything because this is transitory. Some COVID things happened, and we'll talk about COVID things. Some COVID things happened, and they do play a role. And because they happened, we have temporarily higher inflation, but it's not going to stick around. Well, it's continued to stick around. Now the Federal Reserve has said, well, we are going to be more hawkish. And what that means is they're going to try to fight inflation. That can happen through a lot of the ways, but one of the ways that they could do it is by structuring their policy in such a way that the interest rates rise in the economy. It becomes more expensive to get a loan. Becomes more expensive to get a loan, then people are going to borrow less. One way the Fed can do this, for example, is print less money, put less money into the system. But there's still some weird things going on. Again, the Fed says that it wants prices to fall. Like we mentioned, housing is probably the biggest piece of CPI, just by percentage. If I remember correctly, it's like 42% weight of the CPI is housing, which makes sense. Close to half your budget probably per month is on like your mortgage or your rent or something like that. Maybe a little flexibility there. But the Fed right now is engaged in a process of buying what's called mortgage-backed securities. In other words, more than any time in history, by the way, this is a recent thing that started happening. The Fed has actually got involved in specific markets. And so the Fed is using its money not just to give to banks to give out loans, but now the Federal Reserve is actually buying financial assets called mortgage-backed securities. The weird thing about what the Fed is doing right now is they're saying they want prices to fall, but they're contributing to the demands for the good that matters the most in the CPI calculation. In other words, when the Fed buys mortgage-backed securities, ultimately what that leads to is higher housing prices. It is the result. So there's sort of a weirdness going on where there's like a mixed messaging. It's not like they don't understand this. This is something that you would learn in like an intermediate macroeconomics course. It's not fancy economics that they don't understand. A lot of times when policymakers are doing something that seems foolish and you know they're not foolish, there could be a good reason. And so there's different theories on this, but like a running theory is maybe the Federal Reserve does want prices to fall, but also they don't want to displease people in the housing market. Because if housing values fall, then people in the housing market are going to be upset with it. And so actually maybe they're trying to prop up house prices going up while letting the other prices fall. We don't know exactly, but the point is that there's a lot more than meets the eye going on. This brings up this question of, a lot of you maybe have never heard of the Federal Reserve, or if you have, maybe only barely. It certainly is not something that like Joe Biden and Donald Trump debated, right? It's not like this is a big topic, the Federal Reserve. It seems like this is really important though, right? How much money exists in the economy seems like a big deal for your lives. In fact, we're seeing that it is. You might not think that all the inflation happening right now is increasing money supply, but it would seem ridiculous to say that none of it is, given how much our money supply is increasing and how much prices are going up. And so there's this question of, well, why don't we talk about this much? Why don't we talk about the Federal Reserve Board? Well, we don't elect them. It's not a democratic process, so you will never vote for someone on the Federal Reserve chair or board. They're kind of indirectly elected. They're appointed. So basically, you elect the president, and then the United States and the president decides who's going to be on the different boards. There's an approval process like a lot of positions, but this is chosen politically. And the goal of this independent process, the reason you probably haven't heard of this at least stated, is that, well, we don't want the Federal Reserve to be something that is political. And so the Fed says that it wants to be independent. It doesn't want to be pressured by politicians or pressured by voters into doing something that it thinks is bad. Maybe this is a good goal. And so the stated mission of the Federal Reserve is we want to keep inflation relatively low and keep unemployment relatively low. Those are kind of like the two goals of the Federal Reserve. But I've always been a little bit skeptical, to be honest with you, about Federal Reserve independence. We have historical cases that the Federal Reserve actually hasn't been independent. And so famously, when Nixon got in a lot of trouble for other things, they were able to get a lot of Nixon administration things that you wouldn't be able to get from other presidents. And one of them included some recordings of Oval Office meetings. And what they found is that Nixon famously pressured the Federal Reserve Chair, Arthur Burns at the time, to do what he wanted, basically. And that was, well, I want you to print a bunch of money before the election, so that way the economy looks better before I get reelected. So, and you know, we have access to Nixon's information because of the other things that happens, but it does beg the question, well, how often does this sort of thing happen? How often does our president have a conversation with the chair of the Federal Reserve and say, hey, I actually want you to do this thing? Maybe they're independent, but maybe not. Increasingly, by the way, the Federal Reserve has started stepping into policy arenas. And so things like the environment, things like equity, the Federal Reserve has been increasingly concerned with. A lot of economists are concerned with this move because it seems like a step away from the mission of keeping low inflation and keeping low unemployment. There was a letter put out by 50 notable monetary economists on this recently, where they said basically we're kind of concerned about the direction that the Fed is going and thinking about, including things like sustainability and whether or not we give people loans. Seems like picking winners and losers. This doesn't seem like it falls into the normal mission. And so, is the Fed independence? Is this mortgage-backed security thing a corruption thing? It's hard to say for sure, but certainly there's when you're creating 30% of the money that's in the economy, there's probably some room for corruption in that process. And so I want to take on some last notes, some things that I do think are important. And so COVID is definitely behind a lot of this, at least indirectly. Why did the Federal Reserve start printing money in January 2020? Well, it's because we had shutdowns, right? It's because people were losing their jobs in record numbers, the economy wasn't moving. And so sometimes in order to fund the government's activities, they basically hire or contract with the Federal Reserve to do something called monetizing the debts. And so basically the Federal Reserve kind of gives a loan to the government. And so when all these big, debt packages were created, one way to finance that, one way to pay for all of these, bailouts is by printing money. And so that's certainly a piece of it. Also, just all these stimulus checks, the idea, well, we need to stimulate the economy, bring people back to work. Our monetary policy that we talked about earlier, to move people back to work. This was a big part of the printing money too. And so January 2020, the money printers didn't fire for no reason. It's because COVID happened. And the Federal Reserve said, well, we need to stop unemployment from getting out of hand. There were other issues though, like supply chains. We do have issues of businesses were shut down. And just like when there's more money chasing the same amount of goods, prices go up. If the same amount of money chases less goods, prices will also go up. And so if you have a lot less stuff in your economy compared to the amount of money, you are going to have higher prices. So certainly the supply chain is behind some of the inflation as well. The problem with this is whether or not you think this is true, it would actually be worse if it were true. The reason it would be worse if it were true is, let's say our quantity theory of money is true. The The quantity theory of money basically tells us that because of our 42% higher money supply, we're going to have 42% higher prices. If all the inflation to this point has come about because of the supply chain, that means we still have 42% to go, right? That means that none of the money printing and its effect on our prices has been incorporated yet. So that would be a very bad thing. So my hope is that most of this inflation is not from the supply chain, that it's from the money printing, because at least then we're through some of it. If we're not, well, then we still have a lot of inflation to go in theory. Again, and that assumes something like we're not going to suddenly have a depression or recession or something like that. Another thing to point out is one critique of inflation measures is that they don't capture something called shrinkflation. One of the questions I like to ask my students that actually was totally ruined this last year, I'll forever be mad at the Federal Reserve for this, is that there's this interesting question. We've had money get less and less and less valuable over the last 40 years. So we've always had inflation, 2%, is our average is closer to 3.4% or something like that. So we always had inflation. How could the Dollar Tree, for example, sell something for the same price every single year and not lose money eventually if money's becoming less valuable over time? How can they do that? To answer that question, let me ask you another question. You can buy phone chargers for an iPhone at the Dollar Tree. Why don't? Yeah, quality, right? You're exactly right. Dollar Tree phone chargers stink, right? That's the answer that you're looking for. The reason Dollar Tree phone chargers stink is they can't spend that much money on a quality charger because it only costs $1. What we would expect is, I bet if you looked at, for example, the cereal boxes that are at Dollar Tree, what we should expect is over the last 50 years, the cereal boxes at Dollar Tree have been getting smaller and smaller and smaller. That's how Dollar Tree is actually able to keep their dollar prices, even though inflation's happening. They shrink their products, but they keep it the same price. A lot of stores actually do this. There is a thing called shrinkflation. Actually, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I don't know, this could have been an accident. But my wife recently bought like a 40 pack of chicken nuggets, and there were only 20 chicken nuggets. And so she called the company and she's like, hey, I want a refund, because my wife always makes sure she gets her value out of things, which I really appreciate out of her, because I'm a very live and let live sort of person. It's like, yeah, it's not worth the trouble. But she called them and they said, that's a mistake. And then when we ordered groceries next time, there was no longer 40 nugget, it was only the 20 nugget option actually. And it was the same price. And so I'm not saying that my wife triggered some sort of secret change in the quantity that was going on. But what is certainly true is, if you look at produce quality right now, if you look at the size of containers right now, quality of things in the economy seems to be getting worse. Produce is a really good example of this. Go to the store and try to find really good produce right now compared to a year ago. Why might that be? Well, maybe in the past we were throwing out really bad produce, but now we can't afford to throw out really bad produce, and so we put it on the shelves instead. That's shrinkflation. And so inflation actually could be higher than 7.5% for reasons other than just CPI measurement. Maybe our quality of our goods is going down significantly as well. It'd be kind of hard to tell. I certainly have trouble telling when there's shrinkflation or not. And they're very obvious examples of this, that if you look at shrinkflation examples, you'll find people posting the same cereal boxes have now posted or shown smaller quantities. Chicken packs now have less for the same price. This sort of thing happens. And so monetary inflation is not the only form of inflation. Sometimes you can charge the same price for something but make it worse. That's shrinkflation. And so I wanted to kind of wrap up with some of our problems, our insidious effects of inflation. And then I want to talk about maybe some alternatives. And again, not financial advice. But some of the insidious effects, and some of these are summaries. The first is that inflation discourages saving, right? We talked about having that rainy day fund. Well, if you live in an economy where you consistently have 7% inflation, that means your savings value is getting cut in half every year. That's what it means, or every 10 years, excuse me, every 10 years. It's not a good idea to save in that environment. And again, we kind of all understand this is a bad thing. You don't have to be a PhD from MIT to know that we like savings. People should be encouraged to save. They shouldn't act as if their money's on fire. That'll create a bad situation. Nobody has a rainy day funds, and yet inflation causes this problem. Another thing that inflation does is it encourages focusing on riskier investments. So I talked about earlier, I kind of alluded to the stock market is maybe a way to avoid inflation. Well, that's true, but stock markets are also risky, right? And so when you discourage a safe form of saving, you also encourage maybe your riskier forms of holding your money's value over time. It's not necessarily a bad thing to invest in the stock market. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is inflation encourages more risk than just a normal environment with less inflation. Also, there's more encouragement on long-term investments. I won't get too much into details here. If someone wants to know, they can ask. But there's an economist, F.A. Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize quite a long time ago. I think in the 60s even. And his Nobel Prize was about how inflation sometimes leads people to start projects that they're actually not going to be able to finish. And the reason it does that is when there's a bunch of money printed, the interest rate is very low. And when the interest rate is very low, longer projects are less expensive because if you're only paying 1% interest, well, it's not that much money over a 10-year period. If you're paying 7% interest, that's a lot of money over a 10-year period. And so when inflation hits, when there's new money in the economy, people start these long-term projects, but actually eventually those interest rates do rise, right? When prices start to rise, the interest rates are going to start to rise too. Maybe the Fed cuts back a little bit. As the interest rate rises, maybe some of these long-term projects start to lose profitability because they were dependent on future loans and things like that. This is one explanation for what happened with the housing market, actually, the bust. And so this one is a little bit more complicated. I don't have time to go through the whole thing, but this was F.A. Hayek's Nobel Prize was about this. We mentioned the lower wages for workers in contracts, and so if you're locked into an hourly wage or salary or something like that, you get hurt by inflation. And then we have a possibility of stagflation. And stagflation is something that we encountered in the 60s and 70s. But basically stagflation is when you have higher unemployment with higher inflation. And so what happens if it is the case that a lot of people took jobs over this last year because they saw the higher wage caused by inflation? If some of them start to leave those jobs because they say, this is not worth my time anymore, my grocery bill's a ton of money and $10 an hour is really not that good in this economy. So I'm just going to go on unemployment instead. We could start to see rising unemployment with rising inflation. This is a very uncommon thing. It's only happened once in the last 100 years in US history. But it's very deleterious. It's very harmful for the wealth of the society. Stagflation. And you can understand why. It's not good for people to have no jobs and for things to be expensive. And so, we still have some naysayers amongst economists who are saying, no, this is like doomsday stuff. What's the worst that can happen? Well, we've seen the worst that can happen. It's happened to other places. I'm not saying we're on this road, by the way. In fact, we're explicitly not on this road yet. 42% higher prices is a lot, but it's not quite what we've seen in some other countries. And so we have two examples from Weimar Germany. That's the German regime between World War I and World War II. They were famous for having a very irresponsible monetary policy where they printed a lot of money. And here you can see children playing with money as bricks. There are old pictures of money being thrown away in alleys because the $1, 1 mark currency was worth so little that it wasn't even worth holding on to the one worth $1. Zimbabwe was a very recent example. There you can see this actually was printed in Zimbabwe. They've since sort of fixed things a little bit, so these are out of circulation, but for a while they were using, you can see, that's no joke, $100 trillion bills. This is a situation called hyperinflation. Again, I don't think we're on the road to hyperinflation at this point. But you could say, well, how bad can it get? It can get like this. It can get like your civilization. This also happened recently in Venezuela. We saw a lot about this. And so let me answer your questions, all your burning questions about, well, what do I do? There's my disclaimer. Something you should know about me is I'm not a rich man. If I had some sort of insider knowledge, I could be a rich man. So if you ask me for financial advice, wanting to be a rich person, probably not the smartest idea, right? If I could be rich right now, I would be rich first, and maybe I would tell you if I were really nice, but I'm not rich. So that's my disclaimer, is I'm not really trying, it's not really my job. I'm an economist. I do economic research. I'm not a financial expert. So I don't advise people on their finances. I just am looking at the Federal Reserve here. And so don't take this as official Ottawa University or Peter Jacobsen financial advice. Do not come back and sue me, because I have a disclaimer in the PowerPoint. One way that people have turned to, though, some people have decided that they're going to move to cryptocurrency. And so you've probably heard of cryptocurrency before, not a new invention by any means, but it's certainly gaining widespread popularity. Bitcoin is the most famous example. And so you might wonder, well, I've heard about this, but what is it really? Why is Bitcoin, an important thing, or why is it valuable? There's a few features that make Bitcoin attractive if you're worried about printing money. One is that it's decentralized. Now, what that means is there's actually no way to, for example, for the government to go in and take Bitcoins away from people. And I'm not claiming that they would, but the point is that no one can go in and steal from you unless they get access to something called a key, which is really not much different than a key to your house. So yes, someone could literally steal it in the same sense they could maybe steal your house. But the point is there's no administrative center to Bitcoin. And part of that is that there's a big supply of Bitcoin. Right now, Bitcoin is growing, but it's going to grow up to, is it 21,000, Justin?
21 million.
21 million, excuse me. There will be, what are we at right now?
19 million.
Okay, so there's 19 million Bitcoin in existence. There will only ever be 21 million. And that's something that Justin understands. If you have Bitcoin questions, you can ask Justin, because I don't understand the tech. But basically, it's impossible for Bitcoin to grow greater than 21 million right now. And it's at 19 million. So there's a fixed supply. In other words, you can't have printing of Bitcoin like you have printing of dollars right now. And so that's another attractive feature. And there's also very little ability to affect it via political incentives. Again, because there's that decentralized aspect. The Federal Reserve can't pressure the king of Bitcoin to do anything because there's no king of Bitcoin, right? There's other assets, by the way, that rise as prices rise. For example, my decision to buy a house before this all started was actually a pretty good one. I checked and I know Zillow or one of those companies went out of business for guessing real estate prices. So I don't know how accurate it is, but it looks like my house has gone up about $10,000 in value since I bought it a little over a year ago, or about a year ago. And so asset prices, some things move with inflation. Stocks, gold is another example of an asset. But remember, as we mentioned, inflation can actually trigger unemployment and other problems and recessions. Enough inflation can cause these markets to tank too. And so it's not exactly a perfect solution. Like putting a bunch of money in stocks right now, maybe your money will grow as inflation rises, but maybe the inflation will cause a recession that'll hurt your stock market. So this is why I'm not offering financial advice, because there actually isn't a clear way to tell you what the best thing to do is without predicting the future, which I can't do. And so with that, we do have a QR code up for an exit survey, but I want to do a Q&A first. So let's get, I don't know how much time we have left. Maybe we're over time. Okay, it says we've only got about 3 minutes. We'll try to, answer however many questions we can. So questions? Yes.
How do you determine if the economy is heading towards is actually heading towards a recession or hyperinflation?
Yeah, unfortunately, as someone when you get your PhD in economics, one of the first things that you learn is you can't actually answer questions like that. And here's the reason why. I would be lying to you if I answered the question very specifically, because I mentioned that if you can predict where things like stock prices are going, you can make a lot of money off of that, right? And so for example, I'll give you what I personally have done. I have put some money in Bitcoin right now. And so I do have some belief that that's a valuable hedge against whatever's happening right now. It's my personal belief. But I haven't, for example, shorted the stock market. I don't think that the stocks are going to crash tomorrow. At least I don't know that. I haven't put my own money on the line predicting it. So that's my little disclaimer. Some ways that you could tell maybe though, for example, Hayek's theory is called Austrian business cycle theory because it came out of Austria. And this is that Nobel Prize winner. And he said basically, anytime you have a large increase in the supply of money, you're going to have money go into these long-term projects that aren't going to make it. So Hayek's prediction would be, if nothing else happens to counterbalance this, we should expect money printing will lead to a recession. Now they don't give a clear answer of how long that takes or anything like that. Hayek doesn't have answers on that front. But the contention of someone like Hayek would be, unless something changes, we are heading on that road. But again, if I could give you specifics, I'd be a rich person, so I apologize. There are people who can do that, by the way. There's a financier called Nassim. What's the middle name? Something Taleb. Yeah, Nassim Taleb is his name. He was one of these people. He didn't short in the Big Short. He didn't short the market, but he built a portfolio expecting the market to crash in 08 and 09. He ended up being correct. So he has a book on this called Black Swan is one of the names of them, and then Anti-Fragile is another book. If you wanted to look at some of his stuff, he has some specifics on there. He's someone who's actually gotten rich from predictions like this, so he certainly has more to say about them. Justin?
You talked about everybody's bank account being multiplied by 10.
Yeah.
And that it would take a minute for prices to kind of stabilize, and it seemed like maybe we would be the winners in that sense if we could get a Porsche pretty early before prices stabilized. Or, I mean, that seemed like a good deal for me.
Yeah.
If I could get to a lot first. But it doesn't seem like that's how inflation occurs when it's occurring now, that like the money goes directly into my bank account.
Right.
So who are the people that are getting that money first?
Yeah, so this is a really good point that Justin brings up. In economics, we call this cancel-on effects. There's an economist named Richard Cancel-on who came up with this. And what Cancel-on pointed out is when you have this process happen, the person who gets the money the first is the person who's best off. Because if you get the money first, you get it before the prices have risen, you can benefit. So you go and buy something, and then prices rise a little bit. Then the second person who gets the money, well, they go and buy something, and the prices raise a little bit. And so really the person who's worst off is the person who gets the money last, right? And if we could trace that, then that'd be very cool. Well, in some ways we kind of can. I mentioned a lot of this money goes to doing two things. One of them is monetizes debts. And so the Federal Reserve basically is able to support the United States growing its debt by offering these newly printed dollars as loans to the federal government. It's a more complicated process than that, I'm simplifying. But if you look up debt monetization, you'll be able to find out some details on it. And in that case, some of the new money is first going to whoever the recipients of government programs are. Another thing that the government does when it increases the money supply, like I said, is it loans some of that increased money supply to banks. The Fed is called a lender of last resort. It can loan to banks, or it can indirectly get the money through different channels to banks. There's a lot of different ways. It tends to go to the financial system. There have been studies done on this, and frequently the place that the new money ends up first is the financial system. And so basically large corporations who take out large bank loans, people who invest in the financial industry, oftentimes stock prices are sort of a leading indicator of inflation. In other words, as the value of stocks rise first, so the people who own stocks tend to get very rich, and then prices start to rise and kind of follow. So it tends to be the people who get very large loans from banks, people who get money from the government one way or another. Those tend to be the first recipients.
All right, I think that looks like a
Yeah.
good spot to wrap.
Thank you.